Welcome, everyone, to the Bite Size Mental Health Podcast. Let me just give you a brief introduction for those of you who've never heard me speak before. My name is Brandon Santan. I have a master's and a PhD in mental health counseling. I'm a licensed therapist, currently practicing private practice in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm also a business owner where I own my own practice. After my graduate program, I worked for about 8 years at a local hospital part-time and also part-time in private practice. Then I moved to full-time private practice with a group, and then I started my own practice, and I've been doing that ever since. Also, let me give you a quick disclaimer here. Please keep in mind that this presentation is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be misconstrued for medical advice. Always check with your doctor before implementing this information. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive right in. In this episode, I want to talk briefly about the highly sensitive person, or HSP. This is an issue that really is near and dear to my heart. I've been meeting with a lot of patients recently who are HSP, and in full disclosure, I myself am an HSP. Let me briefly explain for those of you who might not know what HSP is. HSP stands for the highly sensitive person, and it's really a cross between a personality trait and a sensory processing sensitivity. There's a lot of nuance in it, and it can look somewhat different for each individual. Think of it as other issues on somewhat of a continuum or spectrum. Some people are really hypersensitive to sensory data, while other people may be somewhat sensitive but not quite so much. This is a trait largely seen in people who are introverts, but it's also seen in people who are extroverts as well. So before we dive in, just a quick shout out to Authority Magazine. Authority Magazine reached out to interview me for this, and this is a brief synopsis of that interview. They asked me the question if I could explain 5 things that people need to know in order to survive and thrive as a highly sensitive person. I've been doing a lot of research on this and talking with patients about it and trying to incorporate some of these things in my own life. It was hard to come up with just 5 because there are so many things that needs to go into surviving and thriving as a highly sensitive person. But I came up with 5 that I think are some of the most important ones to think about. So keep that in mind as you move forward. This is not an exhaustive list. It's certainly a lot more nuance behind it, but this is a good place to start, I think. So with that in mind, let's dive right in. From my perspective as a clinician and an HSP myself, here are the 5 things that are really important related to surviving and thriving as a highly sensitive person. Number 1 really becomes about knowledge. You really have to step back and understand what HSP is and what it isn't. In order for you to not only survive but also thrive, you need to become intimately familiar with what HSP is so that you can confidently move forward in life knowing who you are, why you experience life a certain way, what your limits are, and how to communicate those things to other people, especially important people in your life. It's not enough really just to know that you're HSP, although knowing that you're HSP is half the battle. You also need to know what HSP is all about. I would encourage you to pick up books, read blog posts, engage in HSP communities, which you can find online. There's a few on Facebook. Watch the documentary, find and read the research, and anything else that you can get your hands on. Know what HSP is inside and out. Again, knowledge is power here. Knowing what HSP is will give you the power you need to set your limits, to know your boundaries, to communicate those things with others, practice self-care, and essentially thrive as an HSP. Number 2 is to set up your life as best as possible to honor your HSP, but also realizing that you can't live in a bubble. Many HSPs justifiably want to escape the hustle and bustle and busyness of life, but that's not always possible. You can have good boundaries and self-care, and you can rearrange your life to honor HSP as best you can, but keep in mind you can't live in a bubble. You'll need to participate in society and relationships sometimes despite not wanting to. But that's okay, and the best way to get through it is to set some limits and understand that certain situations are only temporary, and you'll have a chance to rest soon. Number 3 is to realize that you can build tolerance and strength. There will be times that are impossible for you to honor your limits and boundaries, but again, that's okay. When you can't stick to your limits or boundaries, know that you can build some tolerance to overwhelming and stressful situations, and that in doing so, you'll grow stronger. You'll grow stronger in your ability to be in, to cope with, and tolerate overstimulation in time. And just like any other skill, you'll grow stronger in practice. Coping with life as an HSP is very similar to other skill development. With practice and patience and commitment and dedication, you can mindfully live in the present and enjoy everyday moments no matter how taxing or overwhelming they may seem. These moments help you build a tolerance to being out of your comfort zone and strengthen your resolve and resilience as a result. Number 4 is know your limits and honor them as much as possible. It's really important for HSP to know what their limits are, to abide by those limits as much as possible, learn to protect them, and communicate them to others and stick to them as much as possible. If, as an HSP, for example, you get overwhelmed by large crowds, as many HSPs do, know that there will be a limit around how many parties or social gatherings you can tolerate. If you happen to need to attend a social gathering for some reason, such as a work or a family event, learn to excuse yourself as soon as etiquette allows, or even before etiquette allows if you find it too overwhelming to tolerate. There's nothing wrong with this. Try to abide by your limits as much as possible. Number 5, set healthy boundaries around your limits and stick to them as much as possible. Again, you're not going to be able to do this in 100% of the circumstances or situations, but as much as possible, set healthy boundaries around your limits. Surround yourself as much as possible with people who understand or are willing to understand what HSP is or are HSPs themselves. These will be people who would be much more likely to understand and honor your boundaries. For people in your life who don't or won't understand you as an HSP, learn to be confident and assertive in your communication with others about your boundaries and about your limits. And if there are people in your life who just won't honor those things or work to understand them, then it's okay to question whether that particular person or people should be in your life anyway. Finally, I really like this quote by Bruce Lee. Practice makes perfect. After a long time of practicing, our work will become natural, skillful, swift, and steady. Remember, above all, that coping with HSP is about understanding and building some skill around what to do in particular circumstances. You may not know in every circumstance, and that's okay. To get through, just know that each opportunity you come across is an opportunity to learn and grow, to build some skill, to learn communication, healthy assertiveness, and surround yourself with people and circumstances that honor your HSP as much as possible. Well, that's all that I have for you about HSP for this episode. Stay tuned. I'm going to be talking a lot more about HSP in future episodes. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I really enjoy talking about it, and I think we need a lot more societal and community awareness about HSP. This is a topic that's becoming more and more understood, discussed, and researched, and that I'm really excited about. All right, stay tuned. I'll talk about this more. Be sure to subscribe and like this so that you can get notified of future episodes.